Hey, what's up guys, welcome back to Axelis. Today, we are going to be seeing what if Naruto fell in love with Gaara Part 3. Naruto stared at Gaara wide-eyed as she licked his blood from her fingertips, her gaze still fixed straight ahead. The pressure of her hand on his face remained long after the contact had ended, and not for particularly positive reasons. The place she had touched felt as though it had iced over, and the rest of his body shuddered in response. What the hell? He sputtered as Gaara calmly made her way down the stairs. Disturbingly, she appeared to be smiling. Kakashi, who had witnessed the entire scene, shifted his feet around uncomfortably. Hard as it is, you need to ignore her. She's trying to, well, I'm not sure. Just keep your head, he said. The blonde took a deep breath and forced himself to look down to the floor below, where Gaara and Lee were facing one another. Weirdo, he mentally projected at the redhead. A few moments after the thought had crossed his mind, GaaNaru looked to either combatant and motioned for them to begin fighting. Lee needed no further prompting, as he immediately burst forward and unleashed a whirling kick aimed for the sand Kunoichi's upper chest. The strike never came close to landing. That sand, it moved on its own. Sakura, who had recently awoken from her concussion-induced slumber, said in awe. Her observation was accurate, as Gaara's sand had indeed erupted from her gourd without a cue to defend her from the kick coming her way. Once Lee had been repelled several feet, the sediment began to float in an ever-shifting cloud around the redhead's body. What a peculiar jutsu, Kakashi commented as Lee tried and failed to pierce the sandy defenses of Gaara. Naruto furrowed his eyebrows at the sight of Lee's inability to contend with the sand. She isn't even moving. She's just sitting there, letting him tee off, he said in a confused tone. Before either his teacher or his teammate could respond, another voice chimed in. That's because she doesn't need to move. Gaara can and might win this standing still. Kankuro, who had easily won his match earlier, said matter-of-factly. What gives you that idea? Sakura asked skeptically. The puppeteer smirked and leaned over the railing a bit as his sister sent Lee sprawling to the ground with the impact of her sand shield. I've seen her do it before, to more highly ranked ninja than this Lee guy. This won't last too long, he said confidently. Despite a strong desire to refute the statement, Naruto found that the evidence against such a counter-argument was mounting quickly in the arena below. Lee had absolutely nothing for Gaara. Every tactic, every approach, it was all countered and punished by the sand cloud of animated sand. She's going to slow down at some point. Moving around that much sand has to take a ton of chakra, Sakura argued. Kakashi sighed and shook his head in response to the rebuttal. His left eye was uncovered, and he was observing the match below. According to what my eye is showing me, that sand isn't linked to her chakra supply at all. I don't know how that's possible, but there's no disputing it. She won't be slowing down anytime soon, he said grimly. Naruto wrung his hands and looked on helplessly as his fellow Konoha genin was ragdolled by Gaara. Come on, Lee. Find a way, he silently encouraged his comrade. His hopes were further dashed on the craggy shores of Gaara's overwhelming assault a moment later when the redhead flung the jumpsuit-wearing genin into the stone wall with a sickening thud. This may be it, Kakashi lamented as Lee struggled to his feet nursing what appeared to be a broken rib. Little did they know, Lee was far from beaten. Lee grimaced and staggered to his feet. He was tired, sore, and frustration was beginning to creep in. 5 minutes had passed since the commencement of his match with Gaara, and the Leaf Genin had done absolutely no damage. Every time he stepped forward to attack his foe, a wall of seemingly sentient sand would erect itself and protect the redhead from harm. Even more insultingly, Gaara had not moved from her starting position. She had simply stood in place and watched Lee fail to strike her repeatedly. I cannot hit her with the weights on. That much is clear. The question still remains whether or not that sand is set to one speed. It very well might speed up to match me, he thought to himself as he searched for a point of entry. After a moment of pointless analysis, Lee glanced up to the observation deck where Mike Guy stood. There was a brief period of silent communication, and then Guy nodded. Lee promptly removed his leg sleeves and unbuckled the cumbersome training weights strapped to his ankles. "Let's start fighting for real," he muttered, dropping the weights to the ground and cracking the stone as he spoke. Gaara raised an eyebrow at the impact of the weights with the ground, but remained calmly still. Taking the lack or response as a cue, Lee burst forward and closed the gap between himself and Gaara. He led with a straight punch aimed for the center of her forehead, but was thrown off course ever so slightly by the redhead sand. As a result, he missed by mere inches. Almost, Lee thought to himself with a grin as he faded out of the reach of Gaara's sand. After taking a moment to judge the distance once again, he blitzed forward to attack the redhead. This time, instead of charging in a straight line, Lee rapidly shifted his angle to begin his assault from the left. The maneuver worked brilliantly, as Lee was able to crack her cleanly across her jaw with a hard punch that turned her head and buckled her knees. The jumpsuit-wearing Genderbend attempted to build on his success by following up with a kick aimed for her neck and head, but Gaara's sand was able to intercept the strike and toss him backwards. Lee easily landed on his feet with an encouraged smirk on his face. Victory was not an impossibility, and the path was now open. Now brimming with confidence, the Leaf Genderbend set out to strike again. He disappeared from sight momentarily, bewildering Gaara just enough to create a gap in her defenses. This time, instead of aiming for her head, Lee kicked out the redhead's legs and forced her to take a knee. As she attempted to regain her footing, the Leaf Genderbend drove a spearing knee into her midsection that doubled her over. Using her lowered posture to his advantage, Lee stood her up straight with a sweeping uppercut that snapped her head straight upward. He was then forced to exit close range, as Gaara's sand was quickly closing in. Lee took a moment to admire his handiwork once he was safely out of danger and smiled. The redhead was on unsteady legs, her jaw was bruised, and she appeared to still be short on breath from the knee to her solar plexus. "You're not used to getting hit, are you?" Lee observed. Gaara dusted herself off and rubbed the side of her face a bit. "It doesn't matter. You'll be a blood-drained corpse soon enough," she said darkly. She then sent out her sand to capture the taijutsu specialist. Much to her frustration, Lee was far too fleet of foot to be caught. He easily sidestepped the linear path of the sand and promptly punished her for the attempt with a sharp punch that stiffened her legs and knocked her onto her rear end. "You cannot beat me, Gaara. Prodigal child or not, you cannot usurp my hard work," Lee declared as the redhead watched her own blood drip into the palm of her hand from her nose. Despite the boldness of the statement, nothing but silence radiated from Gaara. Choosing to push his luck a bit further, the Leaf Genderbend spoke up again. "Silence implies that you have nothing to say. Has your will been broken?" he asked. Unlike his previous jab at her, these words elicited a reaction. At first, the silence continued, slowly but surely, however, the sound of an incessant giggle could be heard growing louder. Eventually, Gaara rose back to her feet with her eyes cast to the ground. Despite her dejected posture, her shoulders shook with laughter. "What is so funny?" Lee asked as his adversary giggled. At his inquiry, Gaara's laughter stopped dead. She then raised her gaze from the floor up to meet his. Her nose was still leaking blood, but what was truly striking about her was the bare-faced grin on her face. "Do it again," she demanded vaguely. The Leaf Genderbend furrowed his considerable eyebrows and re-established his taijutsu stance. "What do you mean?" he asked. The redhead responded by catching him off guard with a sudden burst of speed manifested through her sand. The tendrils of earth seized Lee by his arms and pulled him forwards. Despite his struggles, he was quickly suspended in the air before Gaara. "Make me bleed like that again." "I insist," the sand kunoichi said, her voice a disturbing crossroads between a hiss and a purr. Lee quickly obliged and slammed his knee into the bottom of her chin, forcing her sand to release him from its grasp. The Leaf Genin rapidly cartwheeled backwards to recreate space, but soon discovered that he was no longer faster than Gaara's sand by any degree. He was easily tripped up by the sediment and sent sprawling to the ground. "Come now, don't shy away. Things are just beginning to get fun," Gaara called out to him as he rose to his feet and backed up to regain his bearings. "I assure you that I'm doing no such thing," Lee growled. He then pushed himself forward with a massive amount of effort, further increasing his speed. Gaara's sand was unable to compensate for the sudden increase, allowing for the Leaf Genin to launch the redhead backwards into the wall with a hard kick to her chest. The moment her back hit the boundary, Lee charged into range and cracked her across the left side of her jaw with a hooking punch with his right arm. Opting to gamble, Lee planted his feet and ripped two brutal strikes into her ribcage and temple respectively. Much to his dismay, the grin had still yet to leave her face. "Good, good. Now give me more," she whispered in his ear as her sand closed in to crush him. Lee managed to suppress his fear and shock just enough to mobilize himself in time to leap out of the way of the sand. As he landed, he looked back to the wall, where Gaara stood unfazed despite the varied assault her ribs and skull had sustained. Even more eerily, she appeared to be anything but discouraged. "She's mad. Completely and utterly insane," the Leaf Genin thought to himself fearfully as his foe calmly strolled towards him. A cut had been opened by Lee's knuckles on the side of her forehead, and the laceration was coloring the left side of her skull to match her crimson hair. "I can't beat her this way. I get a strong feeling that she let me land those strikes. I can't hurt her in any meaningful way as I am now," he thought to himself as he circled Gaara. For the second time that day, the Leaf Genin looked to his instructor. And for the second time that day, Guy nodded. Lee then crossed his arms in front of himself. "No, it can't be," Kakashi said, his tone radiating shock and disbelief as Rock Lee's chakra became visible around his body. The silver-haired ninja turned his attention to his left, where Guy stood in observance of his student's brutal contest. "Is that what I think it is?" he demanded as the room began to shake in the presence of Lee's suddenly immense power. The flamboyant Jonin pursed his lips, keeping his attention fixed on Gaara and Lee. "Yes, it is. And before you criticize me, consider the situation at hand. That boy had nothing. No talent to draw on, and nobody to teach him. When he became my student, I vowed to make him competent," he said rigidly. Kakashi growled and jammed his finger down at the arena, where Lee had begun his renewed assault on the maddened Sand Kunoichi. "A genin has no business using such a strenuous jutsu. It could kill him," he hissed. Guy's hands curled into fists as Lee brutally rocked Gaara's head from side to side with punches. "He can take it. I know he can," he assured his old rival. The copy ninja took a deep breath and forced himself to return his attention to the match. What exactly has Lee done? He was losing a minute ago, and now he's beating her senseless, Sakura asked curiously. Kakashi revealed his left eye once again and focused it on Lee. "He's utilizing the 8 gates formation. Our bodies have 8 separate limiters, or gates, that regulate the flow of chakra through our system. These limiters can be forced open with practice, allowing the user to gain an enormous amount of power temporarily. As of right now, Lee is only using one of the 8-inch," he explained. Naruto and Sakura both looked on with wide eyes as their comrade tuned Gaara like an old clock. "If this is what one gate does for you, what does opening all 8 do? Make you into some kind of god?" Naruto asked. It was now Guy's turn to speak. "Opening all 8 would grant even a genin like yourself power that rivals that of the 5 Kage, if only for a short time. Unfortunately, doing such a thing will result in your death the moment the power wears off. Using even a single gate is incredibly dangerous for the uninitiated," he revealed. Kakashi glanced at his fellow jonin. How many does Lee have access to as of right now? He asked. Guy held up all the fingers on a single hand. 5 gates, and it looks like he's preparing to open the second right now, he said. The silver-haired ninja shook his head and gripped the railing. This is madness. I can barely open the first without feeling sore the next day. How can a mere boy open 5? He muttered. A moment after the sentence left his mouth, the jumpsuit-wearing genin definitively released the second gate. Any fatigue he had begun to show mere seconds beforehand vanished. Lee then went on the attack, kicking Gaara straight up into the air. A primary lotus while using the second gate, HM. Creative, Guy commented as his student battered the redhead further and further towards the ceiling. Once the pair had reached the upper boundary, Lee seized her from behind and corkscrewed them both downward at alarming speed. A split second later, he spiked her straight into the floor and leapt off to the side to avoid the impact. Hell yeah! That's gotta be it. Naruto cheered as the dust settled. Unfortunately, his and Guy's lively spirits were short-lived, as the body in the crater created by the impact dissolved into sand. A clone. When and how? Guy demanded as Gaara reappeared behind Lee and forced him to evade a wave of sand. Kakashi stroked his chin and studied the combat carefully. Lee missed at least one of those kicks on the way up towards the ceiling, probably due to the stress on his body. That girl is crafty, so I'm guessing that's when she did it, he theorized. You said something about Lee using that move while the second gate is open being unusual. Why is that out of the ordinary? Sakura asked. Guy nodded and flinched as his student was struck side-on by a condensed pillar of sand. Generally speaking, the first gate is all that is required to perform the primary lotus. You can do it from the second, but that's just a waste of energy in most cases, though the impact will be greater. If I had to guess, Lee skipped the first gate because he feels that this Gaara is too durable to be phased by the first gate. And, based upon what we've seen, he was probably right to do so, he extrapolated. A beat later, Lee backed up and lowered his stance once more. Is he going to push it even further? Kakashi breathed. Guy nodded his head solemnly and allowed his body to relax. Yes, it seems so. I don't know who that girl is, but she certainly isn't a normal genin. Anybody else in this room, even Niji, would be unconscious by now. Either that or dead, he said. Sakura shuddered as she recalled Gaara's brutal and ruthless murder of Zaku. She's anything but normal, she said tensely. A massive pulse of intense chakra then ripped through the room, signifying the conclusion of Lee's ascension. He's at 4 gates, Kakashi reported. Before any of the observers could react, Lee crushed the distance between himself and Gaara in an instant, breaking the sound barrier along the way. The redhead was then launched into the air as she had been once before. Then, an assault of monumental magnitude occurred in the airspace of the stone room. Gaara was bounced from wall to wall by Lee's fists and shins, with each impact more severe than the last. After a 30-second thrashing through the air, Lee released one final expulsion of chakra and prepared his ultimate strike. 5 gates. His body is ripping itself to pieces, Kakashi said with wide eyes. At those words, Lee unleashed the last of his body's tolerance into a violent punch to Gaara's gut. The redhead was sent soaring to the ground as Lee fell from his aerial post. Gaara's body was crushed into the floor and sent up a storm of dust and debris. There was then a stretch of tense silence as the obstructions cleared. What they saw was horrifying. Gaara stared up at the ceiling in a daze. The room was spinning, and her sense of direction was temporarily wrecked. After a few moments of reorientation, the redhead gasped for air and moved each of her limbs to make sure they were still intact. Much to her surprise and relief, none of them appeared to be broken. It took only a brief consideration for the sand kunoichi to decipher what the savior of her life had been. Pressed to her back was the remnants of her gourd, which had melted itself into a cushion of sand. The impact would have killed me, no question. How jarring, she thought apathetically. She then sat up straight and glanced to her left. It seems he wasn't so lucky. Oh well. All that remains is the satisfaction, she thought with a smirk. She then stood to her feet and began a slow, menacing walk towards the battered and broken Lee, who was struggling to rise to his feet. Well done. Well done indeed. You're the first since my father to batter me like that. Be proud of that feat, she complimented the leaf genin as he glared at her with lamentable malice. Instead of taking hold of him with her sand, Gaara opted to grip his throat directly. Once she had established a vice on his neck with her left hand, she ripped him off his feet and suspended him in the air. You've lost. Now, give me your tribute to Mother, she said huskily. Lee's eyes widened with terror as he was thrown to the ground. The deranged redhead then sent her sand into action to crush him to a pulp. The sediment crashed into the floor where the beaten genin laid, cracking the tiles badly. Ah, such a beautiful carnage. Gaara purred to herself. Her satisfaction, however, was short-lived. Standing in front of Lee, seemingly having saved him from a brutal flattening, was a man of greater stature and similar appearance. What are you doing here? This doesn't concern you, Gaara asked, her voice rife with irritation. The larger man shook his head and stood his ground. You had already beaten him. I will allow no senseless violence to occur. Especially regarding my own student, he said firmly. The sand kunoichi's eye twitched. Why save him? He failed you without a shadow of a doubt, she asked skeptically. The jonin remained silent for a moment before speaking. Because he's my precious student, and I love him, he said bluntly. Gaara stared at him blankly, a cog in her mind long unoiled trying and failing to turn. You, what? She said in a dumbfounded tone. When she received no answer, the redhead clenched her jaw and turned her back to the pair of similar-looking shinobi. I'm done, she hissed, taking steps towards the stairs as she spoke. Before she could make it even halfway to the stairway, a collective gasp rippled through the observers. Suddenly feeling compelled to turn around, Gaara glanced over her shoulder. Lee was back on his feet, twitching with what appeared to be life. His body shook like a tree in the wind, and his skin seemed thin as paper. What on earth? Why? How? Gaara thought to herself, a degree of panic creeping into her conscience for the first time in many years. After a few moments of confusion, it was discovered that Lee was, in fact, entirely knocked out despite his erect posture. At the revelation, Gaara relaxed and trudged her way up the stairs. Once she reached the observation deck, she made a slow walk for her siblings. Along the way, she stopped parallel to Naruto, who eyed her with abundantly obvious fear. Instead of reaching for his cheek as she had before, she put a hand on his shoulder and allowed a dark smile to creep across her lips. Thank you for your earlier donation, Naruto. Alright, that's it for today's video guys. Let me know how was the story down in the comment section. Also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I'll catch you in another video. Peace.